Good morning. We're going to do this a little different. I have too much energy to sit, and I have to see the slides. And so, and Betty, so we're going to kind of tag team this. And this is a slide that we wanted to start with, and this is all on your the PowerPoints. But this is a slide that really kind of sets the agenda, because the funding model for community colleges, it has a lot of variables that play into it. And if you can see the economy piece on the side, we know how much the economy impacts our enrollment, but it also impacts the funding that we get from the state, and then also our local funds. And during our presentation, we're really going to cover the colored boxes, the state funds, the local funds, because those are two major revenue sources for us, and then the students that is the tuition and fees. And so that's going to be the real focus of our presentation today. But again, I think this gives you a really nice understanding of all the pieces that play into our funding model. And then at the bottom is federal funding, which comes in as grants, but federal funding is really important for our students for financial aid.
Basically, we have three sources of operating revenue. Tuition and fees, and there are no limits on increases. This requires your board to approve your tuition and fees. But as you heard earlier, it's a real issue for our students that we need to provide access at the lowest cost to our students. And we have Pell funds that do help out with that, but as you also know, you heard Brenda say, there have been a lot of changes in eligibility, so you're going to hear us talk just a little bit more about that. Then local taxes, most community colleges have tax rates under the state cap, which is 50 cents for most of the community colleges. And increases are subject to that 8% rollback that you hear about. As you know, as board members, you have to also have a number of open meetings if you make any change in your tax rate. And there are two types of taxes. There's the maintenance and operations tax, and then there's interest and sinking fund. Those are for the bonds that you have to have voted on by your taxpayers. And of course, state appropriations. The actual amount of state appropriations has pretty much stayed steady, the total, but we've grown at the same time. So you can see that in our charts that we're going to talk about in more detail, that per student, that's gone down considerably for community colleges and the percentage of our budget as well. And we did implement a new model, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. For the first time in a number of years for community colleges, we went out and invested in and asked the legislature to help us invest in success points, where we actually look at students moving through our system, and Brenda will talk more about that in a little bit as well. So we're the only segment of higher education that is doing that. Right now, the universities are not under that same model. This chart just gives you the percent of revenue by source, and I think what it really points out to you is I'm one of the people that might remember 1980 because you heard 40 years. So I've been doing this a long time. And when I first went to Houston Community College, we actually, for the first time, I think the only time, we received 100% funding off the formula. There was one biennium that we did. And so 68% of our budget came from the state at one time. And you can see that's the red line up there, how it's declined now to about 24% for most of our community colleges. It'll vary a bit, but it's about 24%. This is a statewide. And then you can also see how tuition and fees and taxes have tracked. And tuition and fees are really the area that has been impacted the most, because in a lot of our cases, we have small tax bases, and some institutions do, so the tuition and fee has gone up more at those, and I'll talk a little bit more about that.
One of the things that it's important for you to realize is how different each of the 50 community college districts are. And while we have the three main sources of funding revenue, when you look at these next slides, you'll see that our makeup is different. So this shows you the statewide breakdown between tuition and fees, property taxes, and then state appropriation, and it compares it to San Jacinto College. And you can see and this comes from our annual audits, San Jacinto College is pretty much in line with where the state average is. But if you go to Wharton,
There again, we're quite different because we have a very small tax base and we serve a very large area. There are a number of community colleges in the state, we're mid-sized, that do that. So we don't have that money coming in from taxes. So we're going to be heavier in tuition and fees. And as you go down to smaller institutions, that may impact them even more. So the great thing about community colleges is the variety of community colleges, but there's a huge variety of resources, even though we all have these three funding sources.
And this is Clarendon, which again is a small college of enrollment, is around 1,200 students. And again, you can see even a lot less reliance on property taxes. They have a very small tax base, but you can see how important the tuition and fees are. And then the next one is a larger college, Tarrant. Tarrant is around 58,000 in enrollment, and a much higher reliance on property taxes because they have such a large tax base. Their tax base is around $150 million, or $150 billion is their tax base. Again, so very different allocations, and what is really important is, as a board member, to understand how those revenue mixes really impact the college that you're at. This next one, what we wanted to do here, break it down just a tad different, and this is off of our budget documents. And so if you look at the percentages, again, you see they're pretty close to the statewide averages that we gave you a few minutes ago. Those were off of audit reports, end of the year audit. This is off of our budgets, and the percentages don't quite add up to 100% because we also have auxiliary services that go into our operating budgets. And so for San Jacinto College, breakdown's very similar to the state average, except for we have about 4% of auxiliary services.
Now, this one looks quite different, as you can see, because we're so heavily dependent on other sources, and that would be tuition and fees. So you can see the variance in community colleges. Those that have large tax bases can tap into their taxing authority just a small amount and increase a large amount for their institution. And those of us that don't and serve a huge area, our service area includes many, many counties that we don't have taxing authority in. So that limits us in that regard. So our tuition and fees have to go up to offset that loss that we've had in state funding.
So the next thing we want to talk about is fall enrollment. And so this is the community college enrollment history. And you can see right now around 770,000 students enrolled in community colleges for this fall semester. In Texas public higher education, there's about 1.3 million students enrolled in higher education. And so community colleges represent over 50% of those students who are in higher education. The other important factor with that is about 75% of the freshmen and sophomore enrolled in higher education in Texas are in community colleges. So again, the impact that we're making across the state is huge. And this shows you San Jacinto College's enrollment since 2009. And if I actually went back to 2000, we're up about 10,000 students from where we were in 2000. You can see we've been a little flat. We peaked out there for a bit, but then a little flat, really driven a lot by our economy. Right now, for the census day, which is the 12th class day on a 16-week semester, we were at 28,414 students. If I pulled enrollment today, we are right at 29,790 students because we have so many parts of term going on. And so while we capture that 12th census day, it really is important to know that our students, our colleges have really created a lot of flexibility in the schedule, so students are continuing to enroll. The other little line on the bottom was our Pell Grant, or our Pell students. And so again, financial aid is really important, and Betty will tell you about the impact of financial aid for Wharton.
If you look at our enrollment, we've increased a great deal, but you see the peak, and that happened during the recession. A lot of community colleges experienced that, and that's typical. We run counter to the economy. So when the economy's bad, we're up, vice versa. We are running a number of variations in our offerings, like 8 weeks, 6 weeks, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, semesters, to allow students to take advantage of those times and to schedule those times. So that helps our enrollment as well. We run about 7,500 students, semester hour students, at any one given time. Now, if you look at that bottom number, that's really impacting some colleges. The Pell eligibility has changed, and that has impacted a number of institutions more dramatically than others. We lost, when the change occurred in eligibility, we lost 400 students almost overnight. And so you can see the impact that we have taken a huge dip in the Pell, and this also includes the subsidized and unsubsidized loans that our students take. So we're seeing a trend among institutions that students are not taking on the debt that they were before. That's good. I would say we would love to see that, but a number of them just aren't going to college, so that's another issue. But the changes in eligibility are sometimes subtle because the federal government will allocate more money for Pell that a student can apply for, but they will change eligibility. In addition to that change, verification of their Pell application has become very, very complicated. They're using different forms, and at times a student will go through the process several times, and by the time they get through, or they don't get through, is what happens. They just give up. So I think that's hurting our institutions in providing access to the students that we need to serve. This slide just shows you the average tuition and fees per semester hour, and you can see that the green bar there is the out-of-state, the international student, and that has changed a bit, but where you can see more dramatic change is in the out-of-district tuition and fee that most of us are now charging. But overall, if you look at this picture, we haven't changed a whole lot. We've tried to keep these fees, tuition and fees, down for our students, and that's admirable for our institutions at a period in time where we're really not receiving that higher percentage of state support.
So if you look at San Jacinto College, again, the one thing is you have to understand the tuition and fee competition you've got and where you're trying to, what your strategy is around tuition and fees. So San Jacinto College, our in-district average is $59 a semester credit hour. We are much lower than the state. And if you look at the Gulf Coast region, which Betty and I are both located in the Gulf Coast region, and there's 9 community colleges there, our in-district is actually the lowest in the whole Gulf Coast region. Mm-hmm. Our out-of-district is at 89, or at 101. We've had pretty significant increases over the last few years around out-of-district. And our debate is always, where should out-of-district be positioned in relationship to our in-district? And then also, how does our out-of-district need to be positioned in regards to all the other community colleges that are in our region? And so we butt up against Houston Community College, Lone Star, College of the Mainland, and Lee. And so we're always looking at how does our tuition and fees compete with theirs? Because it is a competitive market out there. And then you can see our international average is $161. One of the things our board is looking at is differential tuition model. We're also looking at a 3 to 5 year strategy around our tuition and fees because we know we can't continue to remain at this lowest cost in the Gulf Coast region.
And with Wharton, it's a little bit different. Have always attempted, our board has, to keep our in-district to our taxpayers lower. And we've done that, although we've had to go up some because just simply the economics, faculty need raises, they need cost of living increases, we need more staff. Our board just approved, or will be approving, 2 new positions just to deal with federal and state regulations. So the more of those that we impose upon the institutions, the more we have to hire staff to take care of that, the compliance issues. We have the same sort of issue that San Jacinto has, in that we are very close and part of the Gulf Coast service area. So we are in competition with other institutions, and yes, that is healthy as a state to have institutions there, but at the same time, we're not in the same situation because of the taxing issue. We have a very small tax base. It's Wharton County and the Needville Independent School District. We serve a very large area, so to provide that service, we have to charge more for our out-of-district students. We are 75%. Our students come from out of our district right now. And that we're not alone in that. There are a number of community colleges that started in a very rural area. Then when the legislature enacted service areas, we were given a very large service area. So we are serving those students to the best of our ability. We have partners that we're working with. TSTC is one of our partners to do some of the workforce training for us. But we're doing that, but having to charge a higher out-of-district tuition to serve those students.
And in contrast, at San Jacinto College, we actually have 6 school districts in our taxing district and only half of a school district in my service area. And so about 47% of my students are in district, but still 53% out of district. So again, quite a contrast there. So property taxes are another interesting component. This gives you a summary just of how the taxable values have really increased. So over the last, since 2003, the valuation of property taxes within the taxing districts of community colleges went from $685 billion to $1.35 trillion. You can also see the tax levy for community colleges from $730 million to $1.78 billion right now. And we'll give you some examples of our colleges and the impact of those rates. So this gives you a nice summary, just again showing you that values have increased about 70%. There is a real issue because there is a lot of districts that have very small taxing districts. I'm one that has a very strong taxing district, but there are a lot of rural areas that don't have that. And then from a standpoint, the levy has become much more important to each of us. If you look at this next slide, it gives you a bar chart of the values, and so you can really see from 2003 those increases in the taxable property tax values. And then if you go one more slide, you can see that the property tax levy, again, this is total tax levy. And so it includes the maintenance piece of property taxes, but also the debt service, and again, the increase there. This chart, you probably can't read the numbers, but at San Jacinto College, our maintenance and operation tax is 10.7 cents. Our cap on M&O is at 20 cents, and that was set up when we were created. Our debt service rate is 5.8 cents. And it is, we have a cap on our debt service at 50 cents, which is actually a state statute. So our total tax rate is 18.56 cents. For this next year, we're going to be 17.56 cents. And our debt service rate is going to be increasing over the next few years because we just approved, our voters just approved a $425 million bond. And so we will have a maximum of a 3-cent debt service increase. You can look at that my tax value is around $44 billion, and that's very strong. We've had a tremendous growth in our tax base because we're in the heart of petrochemical, and you can also see the M&O revenue is about $56 million a year. Our debt service revenue is $25 million a year. Again, a lot of reliance on our property taxes. The other part of the chart is Betty's side, so go ahead, Betty.
Well, you can just, you can really see a contrast here because we've got a similar maintenance and operations tax at 12.65. We have no debt at this point as far as bond. We have revenue bonds. That's been the main source of helping us build facilities and maintain facilities, but we have no other debt. And we have a cap of 20 cents on that maintenance and operation. Now, really, when you look at the tax base for our institutions, look at the significant difference there. You go from $44.2 billion to $4.1 billion. So, I mean, there's a huge variation for smaller rural colleges that are serving very large areas.
This next slide gives you a contrast again, and so the top line is my tax assessed values, and in 2000 they were at 23.9 million, and this last year 44.2, and actually for this year they're at 48 billion, and then you can see Betty's below at 1.8 growing to 4.1. Again, tremendous growth. And you can see little dips in there. That year where it dipped down, it hurt because you know, we had been moving forward based on a different trend line. But of my tax base, 51% is petrochemical industry, which is and that's where there's growth right now. When we went out for our bond, only 20% of my tax base is from residential, and so we had very, very strong support from industry because of the need for the workforce training facilities.
And if you look at ours, we're a rural area, so we've got a lot of ag in there. We've also had some oil and gas, not the industry, but the oil and gas themselves go up and down, so you can see that trend as well. And right now, it's not an advantage to anybody to do drilling at this point in time, so we've seen the downturn in that. And we have very light industry, really, that's in our tax base, so that also. The only thing we've seen is the value change that has been brought about by the Central Appraisal District that's really made an impact for us.
And this slide just gives you another way to look at the property tax revenues. And again, the top line is Sanjak's maintenance and operation. And again, the reason our tuition fees rates can be so low is because of our heavy reliance on maintenance taxes. The second line is our debt service tax. And we have been in a huge growth and rebuilding and renovation of our campuses. And so that's why you see the debt service, a significant growth in that over the last 10 years. And then Betty's line, again, some growth, but pretty stable.
Yeah, and it's, unfortunately, the growth that we have is so dependent on oil and gas and exploration that we can drop significantly at any one period of time. So we can't really rely on that as much as we do the other portions. We're going to talk now a little bit about the state budgeting process and how that works. As you can see from this particular example, the state revenue sources, and I think most of you are familiar with those, but just to refresh you, sales tax, fees, lottery receipts, interest income, federal government, ending balances from previous biennium. And a lot of that has gone on in the past, a little difficult to follow sometimes where those monies are going and flowing through the system. But this just gives you the biennial budgeting cycle that for community colleges particularly, but for the whole state of Texas, all agencies receive a request from the Legislative Budget Board for a budget. And they have a format, and we submit that. But for community colleges, we usually submit one unified request. Now, we all have to fill out a form, obviously, but we submit one request as a whole. And your trustee group has worked with us in the past to attempt to get that before the legislature. And both the Senate and the House have a bill, appropriations bill, that goes through their process. It comes from the LBB and then goes through their process. Each one will take a different view. One is more conservative than the other at times. One has a special interest in something. And they'll have a number of hearings in regard to that particular bill. And then they'll come out, each one, with a bill that they approve. Well, they're never the same, as you know. That's not typically going to happen. Some days we're treated better by the Senate, sometimes we're treated better by the House. It just depends on what their priorities are in that session and how we can fit within that priority. Ultimately, what happens is there's a conference committee that's formed by members of both and the Legislative Budget Board, and then they come to terms with that, and then they come back with a bill that can be approved by both houses. So that's that process in a real quick review. We're very thankful that it happens once every 2 years as opposed to once every year. I have people ask me all the time, how can y'all manage with legislature that only meets on a biennium? basis, and I said, I'm thankful every day to Jesus for that. So this is just another overview of the markups that occur, and I don't want to make light of this process. We live up here doing this process. But at this last session was a little unusual in that we didn't really fare too well after the budget came out from the LBB. So we are taking a little bit of a different stand and being a little more proactive early on with the budget process, and I know your association is working with us on that as well. This just talks a little more in depth about that, and we're running a little short, so I'm going to move on. I think I'm just going to move on past.
The only
Now-
thing on this
yeah.
slide is the legislative process is so important for community colleges. And the presidents will be up here working, our government relations people will be working, but we need our trustees working with us. And when you heard earlier in that panel about one voice, that's where it's so critically important that we come with one voice. And so the Texas Association of Community Colleges, along with the Community College Association for Texas Trustees, work very closely in pulling together the legislative agenda and then making sure that we're here working that agenda together. And so the one thing Betty had mentioned earlier, we put together one LAR request. We also have the 50 community colleges coming together with one legislative agenda so that we can work that together. And that's being developed right now.
Yeah, that is critical because you as board members are elected officials. We are the hired guns, presidents and chancellors, so they see us with a vested interest always, and we do. Not that you don't have a vested interest, but they see you more in a relationship as a colleague and that you're representing your constituents. So that's why this union of the two groups is really critical. And I applaud those of you that were up there last time. We warmed a lot of benches and talked to a lot of people, but we just need to do it earlier and with a unified plan. State funding for community college. This is just kind of a brief overview. Since some of you are new members, I think this might be helpful. I think I lived through a lot of this, actually. But state funding for community colleges, it began in 1941, and there were 22 college districts. And then it caught on. Community colleges began to catch on, and so more and more were created. Originally, it was $50 per full-time student equivalent. Total appropriations is $650,000. I think that's kind of interesting to note. Fall enrollment only, funded only for the academic transfer, and then it grew to $640,000, and that was with 44 colleges, and we had $125.1 million. In 1967, approximately 50,000 students attended and enrolled in community colleges. And by 1975, there were 200,000. Now, I will tell you, I did live through a lot of that, so the growth in community colleges was phenomenal. The interest nationwide in community colleges was phenomenal. So the state encouraged that kind of growth because they saw the need. A lot of things happened during that period. People came home from the war, and in Wharton County Junior College's situation, that was one of the things that those people needed educational venue. So the changes in community college funding, though, have not really occurred as quickly as one might think. The contact hour formula rate replaced the full-time student equivalent in 1974. So we went from the number of from a full-time student equivalent to the number of students, contact hours multiplied by the cost of instruction. There was a method to determine the cost per contact hour, and then the number of students that you had in the seat time was used as the funding mechanism. And the first formula appropriation was $196.7 million for FY74 under this and FY75. And that's been the primary method for funding community colleges, although there's a little caveat to that. When we first started with that, the actual amount of appropriation was determined by that formula. That's to say, that's what the legislature looked at to fund community colleges. We went from that to a method of distribution. The legislature then came up and said, we can't afford all that, so we're going to just give this flat amount. So they used it as a method of distribution. It was a method of estimating, but a method of distribution. So that has been the continuing methodology used for funding formulas for community colleges up until the last session. So this is just another chart that explores that. So let me move on to the next one here. Now, there's been a change, as I spoke earlier about, and Brenda's going to go into that in more detail.
So in the 83rd session, the community college presidents, we sat down and we met and we said, you know, we're hearing so much around performance funding. If we don't put together our own method of performance funding, we feel somebody's going to do it for us. And so we pulled together a new funding method where we had $1 million out of the Biennium for each community college district for core operations. 90% of the remainder then went for contact hour funding under the method that Betty's talked about. And then 10% went for performance funding, known as student success points. And so out of the 14-15 Biennium, you can see the breakdown. It was about $1.77 billion. And then we can go to the next slide. And then for the 16-17 Biennium, you can see, again, 1.745, and the breakdown between core, contact hours, and the student success points. The student success points actually wasn't at the 10% then out of this last session due to some changes around the funding. And so on the general appropriations bill, this gives you some detail around it. When we went into it, there really was some reductions that happened. There was also a lot of negotiations around, yes, contact hours were down for community colleges across the state, but we also know our costs have increased, and we also knew our student success points had increased, and that our funding levels had been on a declining basis. And so we tried to negotiate that, and so eventually the House Appropriations Bill got passed. But if we go to the next, and I'm going to keep moving forward, this really shows you the instructional funds, so at the billions of dollars, and how that has declined and then came back up, but not to the same levels where we used to be. And if you go one more slide, you can see that our per student, full-time student equivalent reached a high and then has declined, came back up, but we're still lower than we had been at our full-time. And I think I just took your slide, so go ahead.
That's all right. I don't mind your doing that anytime. I think it's also important here to note that during this same period of time, we are doing as much as we can with retention and with students, trying to meet those goals of completion, and those are costly to do. Remediation is very costly at the same time. So that is our plea, is to the legislature, is help us do this so we can get people through the pipeline. And that's why we actually went toward the student success points.
What are the student success points? And so this chart, when you see this, what it's trying to do is capture the mission of community colleges, our open door policy of how we take students, where we take 100% of the students, and how do we move them through the pipeline. And so I'm going to go into some details around that. If you go to the next slide. So really, the student success points is supposed to be each college competing against themselves. We want progress. We want students to get from who aren't college ready to get college ready, and we want to see completion throughout the system. And so that was what we were trying to work on. Really, again, focusing on that a lot of our students go into the workforce, they get certificates, they get associate degrees, but they also transfer. And so how do you continue to measure our progress across that pipeline? And if we go to the next one, the first part of it is around college ready, getting students who are in developmental education college ready, and as they get through developmental education, math, reading and writing, then we would get a point for reading and writing and a point for math. Again, looking at the progress that we're making. And then the next one is entry into college level courses. And so as students progress through and they take their first college level reading and writing course, or when they take their first college level math course, again, we get student success points. And then the next piece is around how they are continuing through the line, the progression. So we get a point when they complete 15 semester credit hours, and then a point when they complete 30 semester credit hours. And then on the credential completion. And so this is around when they get a certificate, when they get an associate degree. We have some community colleges that offer bachelor's programs, so again, they would get a point. And there are some STEM or critical areas that would get a little bit extra. So when you get a degree or certificates, it's 2 points, but when you get a critical field area, it'd be a 2.25. And then the transfer component. So students who transfer to a partner university, a four-year university, after 15 hours, again, we would be earning a point from that. And so we're tracking this by student, and the coordinating board's tracking that, and then we're reconciling that. And if you, at the bottom it says ABE and ESL and GED. We're not able to capture student success points on those data points yet. Ideally, in our, when we get this system all defined, we would like to capture that because we have such a significant role in those areas, and then also the employment factor. Again, the data's not there for us to really be doing that. Around ABE, there's not adequate funding to really make the impact we want to make, and so we see this system continuing to evolve. When we went into the 83rd legislative session, we were very clear that this needed to be a successful system. You have to continue to fund the performance measures. You can't have the cuts around that. And so we went in and it was funded at 185 points per student success point. And then this last session it went down to 173 points. And it really became clear out of this last session, maybe this wasn't the priority for all the legislatures that it had been in the session before. And the session before it had been what we saw as a priority, but on the House side, this time it really wasn't. And so we received less funding per point, and though why 43 community colleges had increases in their student success points, they received, there was less funding because of the reduction. I think I covered them all.
You did. It's one of the, I'll just add that our whole goal was to have colleges compete against themselves, not in a pot with every other institution, because there's so much variety, so much difference in those institutions. So if at Wharton we increased by 5%, that would be significant for us in some areas, but to compete against Lone Star or another institution is not really valuable in that sense. It might be for the state in some ways, but underfunding this caused us now to compete against each other, which is not what we would like to see in the future, Emma. Just wanted to add that.
On the contact hours, we put that back up there. You're going to hear a lot about that and the history around contact hours. And so we felt you needed this definition. It'll be in your slides. But really, if you look at a 16-week, 3-semester credit hour course, that's 48 semester or contact hours per student. And so then you start multiplying that out. But we wanted you to be able to understand how that got calculated, because you're going to hear a lot about that at board meetings.
And it is confusing. Our method of funding sometimes confuses a lot of people. So if you look at, I think this is just interesting for you to know as board members, when we talk about that we had the large enrollment increase, you can see where that was, but then you also see that we've had a slight decline, and you may have heard about that with the legislature the last time. Well, community, we're just funding you based upon the fact that you had a decline in enrollment. But what you need to remember is that we didn't get sufficient funding or an increase in funding really for that period of time when we increased in enrollment. So I think that's important to note.
On this just gives you a total, so you can see the student success points, the numbers being earned across the state, around 980,000, and then the base year contact hours, again, being earned. And if you tried to put that into perspective, so out of that $283 million, or 83 million contact hours being generated, Sandjack generates about 900,000. And then on our student success points, it's around 41,000 that we're generating out of that. And so you can start trying to figure out how your college breaks down with that.
Now let's talk just a little bit about, I think this is your slide though, so I'm taking away from you. The health insurance. This has been an issue for several sessions. The percentage that is supported by the state has gone down for community colleges. So we attempted to set this in statute so that community colleges would receive 50% of those funds from the state. There is a mandated amount in statute that we have to provide for our employees. You don't, as a board, have a choice. You can provide more if you choose, but you have to provide what's in statute. So this has been a dilemma that's been occurring, or a conversation that's been occurring, a dilemma for us in some ways. The state at one point in time, you can see on this slide, in 2003, removed our fiscal plant employees because they felt that should come from our tax base, the support of that. So there has been an eligibility change as we've gone through. Community college health insurance was, I think the slide puts it well, it says contentious. Basically, with the Senate, we were asked to go back and look at that and come up with a percentage, and 50% was what the negotiated amount was. So for the biennium, the 2016-17, it's $318.8 million was appropriated for community college group health insurance. Now, the caveat to that is that there's an addition that says if we don't grow a certain percentage, then that can be decreased. We had an opportunity to petition for that, if those of us that had very small declines during that last session, but that was not upheld. So there are several institutions that have had to pick up more of that, so that is a cost to the institution. We didn't go into detail on that, but just so you know that health insurance is still a contentious issue, even though statute now says that they will pay 50%. There can be changes to that based upon additional legislation or riders, and that's what we're experiencing at this point.
There's a lot of issues impacting community colleges. While we have the three major revenue sources, how do you manage those at your institution, and being able to ask the questions around them. And on state appropriations, the history is important because it comes up a lot. And I think what we have to focus on is how we're going to move forward. And so it is exciting that there's some interim charges looking at funding for community colleges. Mm-hmm. And what does that need to be to really meet the new coordinating board educational agenda, but also how can we make sure that that's sustainable? And I think as you read through these bullets, it really is from a standpoint, we've got to be innovative, we've got to look at new resources, and we've got to look at how we control costs. But there's a lot that goes into how you manage these revenue sources.
And I would just conclude, as board members, for you to understand the funding sources that your institution has, and then you're the big picture people to look out into the future and how can we achieve those goals. Particularly difficult for us is achieving the goal of providing services in an out-of-district area where we don't have tax base. And we're not alone in that. A number of community colleges have that issue. But we don't want to forget that we have a mission to serve the rural areas as well as the urban areas, and I think that's critical for community colleges because otherwise we're disenfranchising a very large population of the state. And ultimately, my concern is access for students to education in a society that we know a student will not be successful unless they have some post-secondary education. You can point out individuals who have been successful that are millionaires and billionaires, but overall, we know full well the value, the economic impact of education, and we need to work together with partnerships. And I would encourage the state, and I am encouraging them to look at partnerships and helping incentivize that. So, thank you very much.